What if the very way we define addiction, how we diagnose it, treat it, and punish it, is all wrong? Not just slightly off, but gravely misguided. Imagine a world where the most broken are blamed for their own fracture, where the suffering are treated as criminals, where the question is always, what are you using? But never, what happened to you? You've heard the narrative, addicts are weak-willed, morally compromised, chasing highs out of selfishness or recklessness. But look deeper, really look. Do they seem free? Do they seem powerful? Or do they look like someone running from something too vast to name? Here's the paradox. The very thing we call a disease of pleasure might, in fact, be rooted in pain. Now ask yourself, what if addiction isn't a brain malfunction, but a survival mechanism? What if it's the most human response to a world that's forgotten how to feel? In the words of physician and trauma expert Gabor Maté, the question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. What if addiction is not a moral failing, but a message? What if in every overdose, every relapse, every needle and pill and trembling hand, there's a deeper cry, a psychic wound the world refuses to hear? And here's the most uncomfortable question of all. If addiction is pain crying out, then what does that say about us, the society, the culture, the people who keep silencing it? Are we addicted to, not to substances, but to silence, to control, to illusions of normalcy? You feel the unease creeping in. Good, that's the beginning of seeing clearly. Because this isn't just about them, it's about you, me, all of us. So let's dig deeper into the roots no one talks about, into the shadows where real healing begins. And once you see what's really beneath the surface, you may never look at addiction or yourself the same way again. Beneath the surface of every addiction lies a story untold, a psychic knot tied so tightly that unraveling it feels like death itself. But here's the hidden truth. Addiction is not the problem. It's the attempted solution. And what is it trying to solve? An unbearable wound of the self. Gabor Maté doesn't speak of addiction as a disease of the brain. He calls it a response to trauma, often invisible, frequently normalized, and almost always misunderstood. It's not about the substance, he argues, but about the pain the substance numbs. The tragedy is not the escape. The tragedy is what we are forced to escape from. Carl Jung once wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." Addiction, then, is not a failure to resist temptation. It's a refusal of suffering the psyche was never given permission to feel. We live in a world that pathologizes sensitivity, punishes vulnerability, and mistakes emotional absence for strength. From a young age, you're taught to wear masks. Boys don't cry. Girls must be nice. Grief must be rushed. Pain must be private. The soul begins to split into the public face and the private ache. Jung called this the shadow, the parts of ourselves we deny, repress, exile. Now imagine living decades without touching your own shadow. What grows in that silence? What thrives in that darkness? Addiction is one answer. Nietzsche once warned that when you stare too long into the abyss stares back. But what happens when you don't even know you're standing at the edge? When the abyss is inside you, woven into your sense of self? The philosopher saw clearly, we crave meaning more than we crave comfort. But when meaning disappears, we don't sit in stillness. We reach for distraction, stimulation, sedation. Arthur Schopenhauer called suffering the essential nature of life, but our modern culture tells us the opposite, that suffering is unnatural, avoidable, even shameful. Is it any wonder then that when pain arises, we flee? That we find ourselves addicted not just to drugs or alcohol, but to productivity, to validation, to our screens and our schedules? Addiction is not random. It follows a logic, the logic of emotional exile, of spiritual starvation. It is the byproduct of a world more invested in image than in essence, more interested in control than in connection. And as long as this root remains hidden, the wound will fester, disguised by symptoms, medicated by silence. But now, the veil is lifting. Let's look at what this denial has cost us, not just as individuals, but as a society. Look around you, not just at the headlines of overdose epidemics, or the sterile rehab centers filled with hollow eyes and trembling hands. but at everyday life. The person endlessly scrolling through their phone to avoid their own thoughts. The corporate executive chained to caffeine and achievement. The teenager who can't sleep without background noise, terrified of silence. Addiction is no longer confined to alleyways and clinics. It's woven into the very fabric of modern living. And yet we barely notice. That's the most dangerous part. We've pathologized the extreme cases while normalizing the milder ones. We mock the heroin user while celebrating the workaholic. We shame the alcoholic while envying the influencer whose entire life is curated escapism. This isn't compassion. It's a cognitive distortion, what psychologists call confirmation bias, twisted through the lens of cultural denial. You've been taught to see addiction only when it breaks the rules. But what if it thrives most where it keeps the rules? Where it's hidden behind success, ambition, normalcy? This is the unseen consequence. We have created a society that rewards certain addictions while criminalizing others. A culture that confuses numbing with functioning, that praises distraction as productivity, and calls the anesthetized life a balanced one. The cost? A generation spiritually numb, emotionally distant, terrified of presence. Neurologically, addiction hijacks the brain's reward system. But ask any neuroscientist. What primes that system is deprivation, emotional neglect, developmental trauma, disconnection. When your need for safety or love is unmet, your brain rewires to seek surrogates, not out of weakness, but survival. And when the surrogate works, even for a moment, the brain remembers, repeats, reinforces, until the craving becomes compulsive, until the original wound is buried beneath layers of behaviors you barely understand. We've built systems that punish the symptom and ignore the cause. Rehab programs that fix behavior, but not belief. Legal structures that jail trauma survivors instead of healing them. Families that cut off the addict without ever asking what they themselves failed to see. The invisible wound becomes a social epidemic. But here's the deeper twist. Many who judge the addicted are simply better at hiding their own compulsions. There are addicts in boardrooms, in churches, on wellness retreats. Addiction doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like control. And until we reckon with this truth, until we see how deeply addiction mirrors the culture that breeds it, we'll remain trapped in the illusion that we are separate from the ones we condemn. But what if there's another way? What if the very thing we fear in addiction is also the key to liberation? To rebel against addiction is not simply to put down the substance. It is to reclaim the part of you that the world told you to abandon. This rebellion isn't loud. It doesn't look like slogans or resistance movements. It looks like quiet courage, the kind that says, I will no longer abandon myself to survive you. Gabor Maté teaches that healing is not about control, it's about connection. The addiction isn't the enemy, it's the wounded child's desperate attempt at love, safety, and escape. To heal, you don't fight the addiction, you listen to what it's been trying to say. You begin by daring to feel what you once had to numb. Pain, shame, loneliness, all of it. Carl Jung believed that true transformation requires a confrontation with the shadow, the exiled parts of the self, not to destroy them, but to integrate them. The moment you turn toward your suffering instead of away from it, the entire architecture of addiction begins to tremble. It is not discipline that ends addiction, it is intimacy. But this intimacy must first be with the self. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that freedom is a burden, that once you realize you are responsible for choosing your life, you can no longer hide behind excuses. In addiction, that burden is temporarily lifted. You are no longer the chooser. The substance chooses for you. It feels like relief, but it is a false freedom, a counterfeit liberation. The rebellion, then, is in reclaiming your power to choose, even when choosing means feeling everything you worked so hard to escape. This journey isn't linear, it's not a clean, upward arc. It spirals, collapses, breakthroughs, and that's okay. Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, taught that meaning can endure any suffering. If you can find the why behind your pain, You can survive almost anyhow. Addiction dulls that why. It mutes the existential cry that says, I matter, my story matters, my healing matters. To break free is to declare that your life is not a chemical reaction. It is a sacred narrative still being written. And the greatest rebellion of all, to live awake in a world that profits from your sedation. So what happens when you no longer run? When you meet your inner exile with compassion instead of condemnation? What happens when you stop numbing and start remembering? That's the threshold. Now, step through it, because beyond it lies the final truth, the one we fear and long for the most. Here it is, the truth we've been circling around, afraid to touch. The revelation that haunts every silent relapse and every desperate prayer, whispered into the void. You were never broken, not in the way they said. Your addiction wasn't proof of weakness, it was proof of your strength. A fragile, clumsy strength, yes, but strength nonetheless. Because somewhere deep in your unconscious, your psyche made a choice. Survive, no matter what it takes. Even if that meant pain, even if that meant shame, even if that meant losing yourself to something that promised relief. You see, what Gabor Maté, Carl Jung, and even Dostoevsky all touch upon, though in different words, is this. Addiction is not a deviation from human nature. It is an expression of it, of our hunger for wholeness, of our desperation to escape isolation, not life. And when you finally stop looking at addiction as a chemical trap or a moral failure, when you finally see it as a cry, something opens. You don't fight the addicted self, you mourn for it, you hold it, you integrate it. The wound becomes the doorway, and the addict becomes the prophet of transformation, the one who has wandered through hell and now returns with a map. But this map isn't clean or easy. It doesn't promise perfection, it promises truth. And the truth is this: the opposite of addiction is in sobriety. It's connection. Connection to your body, to your past, to your pain, to your purpose. Connection to others who see the real you, not the performance, not the persona, but the raw, tender core beneath. And if you're willing to look deeply, truly, nakedly, you'll see something even more radical. You were never addicted to the substance. You were addicted to forgetting your worth, forgetting your light, forgetting that even in your darkest moments, you were still worthy of love. So here's the final paradox. Healing doesn't mean becoming someone new. It means remembering who you were before the world told you to forget. Let that truth settle in your bones. Let it tear the lie from your chest that you are unlovable, broken, beyond redemption. You are not what happened to you. You are what rises in the aftermath. And now, the choice is yours. To numb or to awaken. To forget or to remember. To survive or to live.